Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Raff Donelson about several different topics, including his response to free will skepticism, whether it's okay to make people responsible to make reparations for historical injustices, and his recent work on medieval criminal trials involving non-human animals.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Raff Donelson, Associate Professor of Law at the Illinois Institute of Technology, Chicago-Kent College of Law. Raff not only holds a JD, but also holds a PhD in philosophy, and his research focuses on issues at the intersection of philosophy and law. He's published many articles and book chapters, and he's the co-editor of the Palgrave Handbook on the Philosophy of Criminal Responsibility, which will be published next year, that is in 2025. We've asked Raff to discuss several topics with us today, ranging from his views on free will skepticism, reparations for historical injustices, and a new project that he's working on about medieval criminal trials involving non-human animals. Welcome to the show, Raff. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on these issues related to free will and agency in the law?
Sure. I am a kind of moral, legal, and sometimes political philosopher. I originally hail from Pittsburgh, and I've been living in Chicago on and off for about 15 years. About free will, I certainly wouldn't call myself a free will expert or a free will specialist. Instead, I tend to think of myself as a thinker whose concerns largely focus on criminal law, the criminal process, and punishment. And when you get concerned with those things, issues about responsibility, recompense naturally kind of arise. Mm-hmm. I tend to think, however, that free will and determinism, kind of thought of as these kind of more metaphysical questions, are a little kind of outside my wheelhouse and outside of the scope of what the law cares about as well. So I don't think of myself as concerned so much with those, but certainly with responsibility.
Yeah. Well, before we turn to questions about reparations, we wanted to ask about what you've written that focuses specifically on free will, even though you just said that you're not a specialist. And in particular, in response to free will skeptics like Greg Caruso, you argue that it doesn't matter at all that much for the law or our practical lives more broadly whether we have free will. So can you explain your reasons for taking this approach?
Yeah, sure. As I said before, my basic intention is that free will simply just doesn't really arise in legal context, or often at least in our practical lives, if our practical lives are not spent in philosophy seminar rooms. Now, you might want to say that in court context or practical lives, we simply assume that there is free will. But I think here I would disagree. Instead, I'd say our practices are generally not about free will. In a criminal trial, for instance, we want to know if a defendant has displayed bad character. We want to know if they were provoked or coerced by somebody else. We want to know if they have suffered from some particular mental illness, if they were trying to do something good. These are the kind of questions about responsibility that we pose. We do not ask whether someone's will was determined by events in the very distant past. And I submit that we don't ask that because we don't care about the answer. And maybe we don't care about the answer because we think that even if everybody's will was determined by events that happened in the distant past, we still want to draw important distinctions between people to figure out what we're going to do. The problem with free will skepticism, in a phrase, is that it flattens our moral experience. If nobody is responsible for anything, then it's equally wrong to plot out and execute a murder for hire or to kill a pedestrian because your brakes failed. Those are equally wrong or equally not wrong. But that's really no use to us in our moral lives. The hitman and the person who has bad brakes are importantly different, and we want to treat them differently. And so, for that reason, I just don't think that free will skepticism is of any help to us in our practical lives, which is why we aren't typically concerned with such matters outside of the philosophy seminar room.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, turning to a topic that you've written about recently, reparations for historical injustices like American slavery. If we assume that no living contemporary American caused or is responsible for the injustice of American slavery, one might think that requiring payment of reparations would be impermissible. What are some reasons for thinking that, requiring reparations may be permissible?
Yeah, so uh, some people, like my friend Thomas Carnes, who's doing a PhD at Duke right now, he's argued that we might hold the American state responsible for historical injustices, or other states in similar situations for historical injustices, because while individuals may not have existed during those times when the injustices were perpetrated, often states were around and did contribute to the wrongs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, importantly, for my friend Tom, he thinks that the American state can only discharge its duty of paying reparations in very particular ways that will avoid making kind of non-responsible parties like contemporary Americans pay for those reparations. Now, he thinks that something like a reparations tax, for instance, would be impermissible. Uh, and the idea he has is that if we had something like a reparations tax, everybody would kind of know that the tax is just a label that's kind of hiding the fact that ordinary people are being required to pay for something that they are not responsible for having caused. So he thinks we kind of can't stick in like labels that would allow that kind of maneuvering to occur. The problem with that argument, like some arguments, is that it works too well. Uh, so if you can't do a tax, it's not clear that you could do anything else, because any way that a state can discharge its financial obligations would be some way of hurting present persons who are not responsible, or maybe future if you're like borrowing, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's just no real way, if we accept the premise that we can't um, we can't do things like taxes because they're just this kind of convoluted way of doing the same thing that we're not permitted to do. So in my view, we either have to drop that view about taxes being just a maneuver, or we need to drop the view that we can't have ordinary people who didn't cause, say, slavery to pay to repair for the wrong of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what do you think is the most plausible argument for reparations?
Yeah. So I think given those two choices, you can kind of take this kind of different view about whether taxes are just a runaround or a maneuver, or maybe people can pay for things that they didn't do. I tend to take the second one, which is perhaps the more controversial and startling option. So, as a first pass, I definitely think that sometimes we can make people rightly make people fix problems where they didn't do anything wrong. So when someone causes some harm through no fault of their own, um, I don't think it's actually very odd to ask that person to fix it. And one example I gave in a paper, suppose that somebody gets sick. It's not their fault that they're sick, but they are sick. They vomit all over your rug. It's not that bad to ask them to clean it up. In fact, it seems perfectly fine. You didn't cause them to throw up on the rug. They didn't cause it to throw up on the rug, but still, it's because of them and not somebody else that the vomit is on the rug. So it doesn't seem like it's wrong as a request to make them clean it up. So that gets us already to the point that maybe you can have somebody repair a harm, not a wrong, but repair a harm, even if they're not morally culpable for having caused it. So then the next kind of hurdle, if you think that's a hurdle, is what if they're not even kind of causally responsible?
Right.
Now, one thing that I'd say is it's not clear to me once we've moved from the realm of somebody being morally responsible what the big jump is. But many people think there is a jump nevertheless to be made. Um, and so here, my own thinking is that sometimes it's okay to ask, or actually stronger than that, to demand or require someone to repair a harm when they are uniquely suited or uniquely available to fix certain kinds of problems.
Right.
Now, if they're not particularly onerous, I think this seems pretty obvious to us. Um, there are famous cases in ethics, like the person who sees the child drowning. It seems like they should get them out of the pond if they're the only person nearby. Something a lot more close to home and quotidian. I think often about if a basketball is stuck and there's someone really tall who can get it, maybe that person because they're uniquely able to do so.
Right.
And so it doesn't seem bad to me that we do such a thing. Now, speaking more specifically about reparations, so reparations are a really, really big kind of problem. That is the harm that the wrong of slavery is massive and it's harmed many, many millions of people. This is a harm that really should be fixed, but this can only be fixed, so it seems to me, by spreading the cost of this harm among really large numbers of people, kind of like a kind of national kind of insurance. And we do this sort of thing all the time when people aren't responsible for things. So, the government, for instance, helps people who are in disaster-prone areas kind of with harms that they suffer because of, say, floods or hurricanes or things of this nature. Those people don't get regular flood insurance because they actually are uninsurable. But this is a huge harm, but we just spread it out among all of us and we take care of it, even though nothing that I did caused, Hurricane Katrina or something of the sort. And so that kind of thing it's not unusual to ask all of us to chip in and do our part to fix harms that are really, really bad, and that there's only kind of certain kinds of actors that are capable of fixing it. And so that's how I think about reparations as one of those things, like some other kind of natural harm that we don't seem to take any issue with having all of us chip in to do our part to fix.
Yeah. I've been thinking about this question for a while. In the free will literature, one of the, I guess, popular principles is like a control kind of principle. So if you're responsible for something, like a necessary condition is that thing had to be under your control. And so if your argument is sound, are we going to have to reject something like this, like a control principle for moral responsibility?
So the question is what kind of responsibility we're talking about. I don't think that we're going to need to get rid of that principle because there are at least different kinds of responsibility. So it sounds to me like you're talking about something like what some people call attributive responsibility. That is, whether we're able to praise or blame you or attribute something to you. And then it does seem like we want to do something like have something like a control principle connected with that kind of responsibility. But there's another kind of responsibility that we might call something like substantive responsibility, as it's sometimes called in the literature, where we're talking about whether someone should bear the cost of limiting the kind of consequences for something, and we can just pry those apart. That's essentially what I've been trying to do.
Yeah.
So it's not the case that just because we should, for instance, have the United States government pay for somebody's house because it's been flooded or whatever, that we're going to think that they are attributively responsible for it. Maybe they are, insofar as the United States hasn't like stopped people using fossil fuels and has used a ton themselves. But like putting that aside, just because we think that someone should bear the cost doesn't mean that we additionally think that they should be praised or blamed for the thing happening in the first place. So I'm happy kind of prizing those two things apart. And the thing is, my influence in being in the law, we do this sort of thing all the time. So, for instance, there's in tort law, there's a thing called strict liability. This happens also in criminal law, but less often, where we hold somebody responsible, where we mean that they're going to have to pay damages to somebody who's brought suit, even if we don't think that they've done kind of anything wrong, and we don't think that we should praise or blame them because what happened was a kind of fluke. And so that sort of thing happens all the time with products liability. You know, if a Coke bottle explodes in your face, you don't have to prove that Coke, for instance, did anything wrong, or the bottling company did anything wrong. You don't have to prove anything at all, often. Coke bottle just exploded in your face. You can sue and get damages. And why? It's because what's going to actually happen? Well, Coke is going to spread out the cost of those damages to the billions of people who have Cokes each year. And so for that reason, we kind of all kind of take care of the cost of that. And we think that that's a fairer and better situation than having that cost just lie with the sole person who got that kind of tragic accident. And so, I want to prize apart attributive responsibility and subjective responsibility, and we let that control principle stand.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, this is one of those ways where the word responsible, I find this talking to students all the time. You have to disambiguate so many times to make sure you're not talking about different concepts that are kind of in the same family. But yeah, I've heard people talk about substantive or maybe like prospective responsibility, kind of akin to an obligation or something like that. And I don't know, when I talk to people about what I do and what my research interests are, and I say, oh, I'm interested in moral responsibility, often they just assume that I'm interested in that sense of responsibility and what we owe to each other in the world. Something outside of the free will literature, really, although adjacent to it. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. If we can turn to talking about your new project on medieval criminal trials, sounds like a fascinating project, especially the way that non-human animals were tried for criminal offenses in the medieval period. Could you talk about one or two of the cases that you've looked into where this happened?
Yeah. So first, I'll preface this with saying we have the best records from medieval periods, but there are instances of these trials at a lot of different times throughout history. So let me tell you about just two of these. Also, though these two cases are both from France, I should also hint that is mostly because of records and detailed court records as opposed to them being localized in France. So one case is 1457 in eastern France, in Burgundy, and a mother pig and her piglets were put on trial for killing and partially eating a human infant. And so, like many of these trials, there was a lawyer for the mother pig and whatnot. Unfortunately, this lawyer lost. The mother pig was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. However, the piglets were spared. And it's important to note why they were spared. They were spared because of their youth and because their mother had set a bad example. There's another French case from 1522 about rats that had destroyed some barley. What's interesting about this case is not actually it is its disposition, but it's not the proceedings, because as it would turn out, the rats did not appear. What's interesting about the case is that the defense, which was appointed for the rats, kept coming up with new and funnier reasons why the clients would not appear in court, though they had been summoned. So the lawyer said things like the rats had not gotten sufficient notice, that they were coming from far and wide and needed extra time to show up. And eventually, the kind of most ingenious of all, that they were actually afraid of local cats, and that's why they were not coming to the courthouse. And eventually, the case was continued, but without a new court date set. And so essentially, it was disposed of that way. Yeah, so this is just a sample of the lovely cases that I have been reading about and preparing a chapter for this forthcoming edited volume.
That's fascinating.
That's amazing.
Yeah. What do you think we can learn from this practice of holding non-human animals criminally responsible?
So in a certain sense, I'm still figuring this out. I'll say a little, though, about why I began looking at this, and then my suspicions about what we'll find out as I continue to think about these cases. So I decided to look at these because I was interested in figuring out what were these people thinking about, because they didn't think, for the most part, that non-human animals have quite the same kind of mental hardware that we have,
Right.
And aren't capable of the kind of complex reasoning that we think is necessary for holding something responsible in a way that you can face criminal penalty or really any type of censure. So what were these people doing? Is kind of my thought, my question. Given that for the most part, they don't really think that these are like us. They're not like Disney characters or something like that. So why were they doing this? What role did this play in their lives? And might it tell us something about how much or how little to care about free will in this deep sense? So that's the kind of inspiration for looking at these cases. And one of the things that I feel like one learns when looking at all of these cases, especially because of how cases worked at the time, and to some extent still work now, which is that there's an aggrieved party first. There's someone who's aggrieved, and they have a complaint, and they bring it to the community. Like that's the primary way that it works. Now we have something called the public prosecutor, which is someone who's a state actor who is required to kind of, with the help of police, investigate crime and then recommend charges to be brought. But that's kind of not how things were in the Middle Ages and for most of world history, in fact. It's the aggrieved parties, the victims of crimes, their family, who bring things to the state and say, like, fix this problem for me. Especially when they bring a criminal thing, they're not really asking for you to make them whole in the sense of give them compensation. That's through the tort system. And especially with non-human animals, that's not available. But instead, there's a kind of different kind of moral make me whole because of this thing that happened to me or to someone close to me. What these systems do is try to figure out a way of doing that, or try to figure out a way of maybe even pointing out sometimes when we should just say tough luck. And so I think in the two trials that I gave you, they're just a random sampling. They kind of illustrate these kind of two times. With the rats thing, clearly what's going on is the court, insofar as it's accepting these sorts of reasons and then decides, okay, we'll wait until the cats aren't around. The suggestion is like, okay, I know you're mad about your barley. This is obviously a bad thing that your barley was destroyed. You needed that barley. But like, look, there's nothing we can do about these rats, obviously, right? But in the other kind of case, like your new baby is killed, we have to do something about this. We have to do something about this to recognize that there is something bad that's happened. Um, and pigs are different in their intelligence than other sorts of things. They can be trained to do things like not eat certain things. And so maybe there is something going on here with, while again, pigs don't have the mental wherewithal to engage in complex moral reasoning, they can stay away from certain things. And so, maybe we can kind of respect the fact that something really bad has happened in some ways. And so it's this interesting way that people were trying to deal with the questions that we always deal with wrongs, but like in kind of different ways. And with, you know, uh, no one, no one in these debates brings up the question of free will, which is interesting. Like these sorts of questions were extant in philosophical literatures, but there's not a lot of conversation about this. Like nobody brings this up. They kind of go through the motions of trying to figure out how can we address this more wrong using the systems that we have. And yeah, I think that this might be instructive in some way or other. And so that's kind of where I am in thinking about this. I guess one last thing to add about it is, as might be obvious, I'm somewhat influenced by kind of Straussian approaches to free will and responsibility, and I think that this kind of interrogation of our practices of praise and blame, a historical one, not a contemporary one, I think is the way to think more clearly about these topics, as opposed to a purely metaphysics first approach.
Yeah, I have a question about the pig case. Is there evidence in the literature that you read about whether the people who put the pig to death thought that the pig deserved to die, or was it because this pig is dangerous and we need to protect ourselves? So it's like, is it backward-looking desert or forward-looking kind of moral responsibility?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but it's actually another thing that I think is useful for thinking about the contemporary system of criminal punishment and human animals, which is that under American law, there is no official justification for punishment. It's not like we have a theory, the state theory is retributivism, or the state theory is some type of kind of utilitarian theory or something like that. We don't have one of those. And maybe it's good for kind of familiar reasons from political liberalism about why we don't. Namely that we don't want or need to settle on a theory of that kind. Instead, it does well enough for us to say that, if indeed you tend to favor backward-looking approaches, then maybe this works for that. But if you favor more forward-looking approaches about dangerousness, maybe it works for that. And we don't need to kind of settle that at the state level. Settle that in your own mind, in your own philosophical study. And so I would wonder, I don't know, but I would wonder if a similar thing might have been going on here, that maybe the person whose infant has been killed, is moved to a moment of thinking the pig is morally culpable in a way that retributivism speaks to and tries to answer for. But maybe the other people are thinking more in terms of this is something dangerous, and that's what we're up to. We're trying to incapacitate this particular creature. And in some of the earlier examples of animals at least being punished, if not there being trials, there's this similar sort of thing where it's not clear if it's retributive or if it's just incapacitative. There's examples in the Old Testament of the Bible in Exodus where there's a command to put an ox to death
Yeah.
if it kills. And similarly, it's like, well, what exactly is going on here? What actually is the justification? We're not really told. We're told what to do, how we're going to collectively solve the problem. A more careful description of the problem isn't stated.
Thanks. Those are fascinating cases, and I'm really interested to read the paper, the chapter for that handbook that you're working on when it comes out. Thanks for joining us, Raff. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
I think probably the easiest place is just my website, raffdonelson.com. I have stuff about kind of what I'm doing in terms of my writing and traveling and other projects that I'm up to.
Very cool. Yeah, thanks again. In our next episode, we'll talk about corporate criminal responsibility, and our guest will be Mihalis Diamantis.